A Streetcar Named Desire, Scene 8. Okay, another quite short scene compared to some of the others we've had. The pace of the play begins to pick up around this point, and things are happening a lot more quickly, a lot more dramatically as well. Again, as ever, make sure you've read this scene before watching this video, because I'm only going to be stopping at key quotations and analysing them. So you should have read this through once, so that we can now go through the important bit. In the Penguin Modern Classics version, I am on page 76. But if you're on any version of the play, you can just follow along from the start of scene 8. Now, if you remember, what we've just seen in scene 7 was Stanley's kind of savage glee at the idea that he's finally got everything he needs and feels the moment is right to bring Blanche down, to sort of tear her off her pedestal. He's discovered the sort of truth about what went on at Belle Reeve, that far from being this sort of Southern belle, Blanche instead got herself fired from school for getting involved with a 17-year-old boy. She was developed a reputation in the local community for being very promiscuous, and essentially Stanley felt he was completely justified in doing all of this and bringing this all of that, because he feels like his friend Mitch has been sold a lie by Blanche. There was a lot of dramatic irony in that scene, because we now know stuff that Blanche does not know. She, if you remember, was in the bathtub kind of singing in this quite childlike manner, and there was this horrible sort of juxtaposition between the horrible, brutal, ugly truth that Stanley was so enjoying bringing into the light, and the sort of childlike, fantastical naivety that Blanche was trying to sort of live in, sort of safe in her bathtub for now. Now, scene 8, we're going to see this horrible, awkward birthday party. So Stanley, Blanche and Stella are sat around the table. Mitch has not turned up. Mitch was supposed to come to the birthday party. He has, of course, not come in the wake of Stanley's revelations about Blanche. So you've got this awful scenario where they're trying to sort of act jolly, make the best of this birthday party. But the elephant in the room is, of course, that Mitch is not there, and the reason why Mitch is not there. So let's have a little look. Was there anything I wanted to tell you before we get into it? No. Okay, so we're going to get straight in. Now, first interesting thing for me, page 76, the stage directions at the beginning of the scene I think are interesting, because we're told a lot about the light. It's sunset, but we are told, well, it's dusk, sorry, yeah, so the end of the day, kind of sunset. So a torch of sunlight, the business district, which is now pierced by pinpoints of lighted window. Now, these words, torch, pierced, pinpoints, they all to me make the light sound sharp, right? Like the light is kind of searching. You know that classic bit in any film or TV drama or whatever, where someone escapes from prison and they're looking for them with those big spotlights that they kind of swing around, those big searchlights. It almost sounds like that, doesn't it? This torch of sunlight. Pierced is quite an aggressive verb to use. Pinpoints obviously has connotations of sharpness and perhaps pain. Think about like an injection. So all of the words related to light, which has been a motif for truth throughout this whole play, all of these words related to light are now seeming sharp and dangerous. And of course, I think what we can take from that is the idea that the light is getting ever closer to Blanche, right? The light of truth that she has been hiding from for all this time is now sharp and dangerous. It's sharpening its claws as it sort of hones in on her. She's sitting there with a tight, artificial smile on her face. You know, Blanche, I think, knows at this point that she's coming towards the end, that she cannot hide these things for much longer, and yet she's still trying to keep up this pretense. And again, she tries to make light of it, right? It's the first time in my experience with men that I've had a good deal of men, etc., etc. I've never been stood up, she says. And then, using an imperative form, she says, tell us a funny little story, Stanley. This is all on page 76. Tell us a funny little story. Now, again, she's not being overtly rude to Stanley, but she almost sounds like she's talking to a child there, doesn't she? You know, oh, go on, tell us a funny story. You know, there's certainly at least room for interpretation of a lack of respect there. And then Stanley says very directly, I don't think you like my stories, Blanche. She says, I like them when they're amusing, but not indecent. So again, she's imposing this certain way that he has to be on her. She's imposing on him this certain way that he has to be. I like your stories when they're amusing, but not indecent. Now, fine line there, isn't it? What's amusing for one person is indecent for another. So again, she is really imposing her way of being onto Stanley at this point. And then they decide that no, he's not going to tell one. She's going to tell one. Now, this is a very, very subtle piece of writing by Williams that I think is brilliant and fantastic if you're writing any kind of Stanley or Blanche essay. So if we look at the top of page 77, Blanche starts to tell a parrot joke. So this was a bit of a thing at the time, was that people told these sort of jokes about parrots, right? And she describes the parrot in this joke as having a blue streak and knew more vulgar expressions than Mr. Kowalski. So what she does here, very, very subtly, again, always comes back to that same argument. Does she know what she's doing, or to what extent does she know what she's doing? But essentially, she describes Stanley as being like a parrot. Now, that seems innocent enough on the surface, right? Indeed, she doesn't even say, it's not a direct comparison. What she says is that the parrot knew more swear words than Mr. Kowalski, than Stanley. On the surface of it, not very offensive. However, what's it going to remind him of? When was the last time he heard her comparing him to an animal? Well, of course, it was earlier on in the play when he was described as an ape, when she described him as like a caveman, like an ape. So even though her saying that, oh, this parrot knew more swear words than Stanley, seems like quite an innocent comment on the surface, I think the reality is that it's going to make Stanley feel very, very different. It's going to remind him of the other times she used zoomorphic description of him. Zoomorphic is when you describe someone as like an animal. Right, and then she tells the joke. It's arguably not a very good joke. She throws back her head and laughs. Stella also makes an ineffectual effort to seem amused, so they try and laugh. Stanley pays no attention to the story but reaches way over the table, spears his fork into the remaining chop, which he eats with his fingers. So, what is Stanley doing here? Why is he leaning over the table, spearing his meat and then eating it with his fingers? I think clearly what he's doing at this point is he's asserting himself on the situation. He's saying, right, I'm an animal, am I? Right, well, if I'm an animal, then I guess I might as well behave like an animal. Apparently, Mr. Kowalski was not amused, says Blanche. Stella says Mr. Kowalski is too busy making a pig of himself. Again, innocent enough metaphor from Stella, right? People always say that, don't they? If you're eating loads, people say you're making a pig of yourself, or if you're, you know, you mucky pig or something. It's not on its own, I don't think it's considered incredibly offensive to say that. But at the same time, all of this is reminding Stanley of how he's regarded, of this animalistic way he's regarded. And it's one thing hearing it from Blanche, but it's another thing hearing it from Stella. And this is what is starting to affect him so dramatically, is he feels that Blanche's opinions and attitudes are now starting to rub off on her sister. She asked him to help her clear the table, and then in a moment of extreme violence, he gets up and he throws the plate at the floor. Very shocking moment, and again, I don't want to say too much and ruin the ending, but certainly a bit of foreshadowing for what is going to come next. That's how I'll clear the table. He seizes her arm again, violence. Don't ever talk that way to me. Pig, poleatt, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. These kind of words have been on your tongue and your sisters too much around here. What do you think you are, a pair of queens? So again, he's suggesting that it's Blanche's presence in the house has made Stella start to see him in this way and use these kind of words to describe him where they wouldn't have been there before, regard him as less, when, as you're going to see in a minute, he claims that never used to bother her. He then goes off in a mood and has a cigarette. Blanche obviously is starting to realise what's happening here and is asked, what happened while I was bathing? What did he tell you, Stella? Stella still hoping she can protect the situation. Nothing. Then we don't really need anything from page 78 until we get to a really interesting bit at the bottom, which is Stanley talking at the bottom of page 78. And what Stanley says here is, so it's going to be all right after she goes, after you've had the baby, it's just me, you and me again. Do you remember those nights we had together? It's going to be sweet when we can make noise in the night the way we used to and get those coloured lights going. So a couple of interesting things. First of all, at the top of page 79, he uses the idea of coloured lights to describe their sex life, which obviously juxtaposes really nicely with Blanche wanting to hide in the dim light, wanting to hide away from bright light, whereas Stanley craves the bright metaphorical lights that him and Stella's sex life used to give them. But also what's interesting in there is that that's what he thinks their relationship needs to get back to. That's the solution to this problem, is to regain that animalistic sexual passion. That's where, from Stanley's perspective, the salvation, the saving of their marriage lies in the sexual animalistic aspect of it. Then Blanche comes back in and tells Stella not to light the candles on her cake. She starts being quite melodramatic at this point. She says, I hope these eyes are going to be like candles, like 2 blue candles lighted in a white cake, talking about Stella's baby. And then Stanley, obviously not even pretending to be nice anymore, says very sarcastically, what poetry? Which prompts Blanche to then take this metaphor of candles further. His auntie, so she's talking about herself in the middle of page 79, his auntie knows candles aren't safe, that candles burn out in little boys' and girls' eyes, or wind blows them out, and after this happens, electric light bulbs go on and you see too plainly. So then a little metaphor of her life, really. So, the soft light, the gentle life of candles disappears at some point, and you're left with this clear electric light. But remember, even on this very same page, Stanley was describing how coloured lights, he was using the metaphor of coloured lights to mean a very, very positive thing. So again, light is so fascinating in this play. I love what Williams does with light throughout this play. It's so interesting to look at the way different characters use light imagery to show the different ways they see the world. Bottom of page 79, Stanley complains about the steam from the bath, and Blanche says, I've said sorry so many times, and she claims that she's using the bath for something called hydrotherapy. Then she says, you healthy Polak, without a nerve in your body, of course you don't know what anxiety feels like. And that leads us, I showed you this quotation way back at the very, I don't know when it was, just after Christmas, I guess, when we first started looking at this play. I'm not a Polak. People from Poland are Poles, not Polacks. But what I am is 100% American, born and raised in the greatest country on earth, and proud as hell of it. So don't ever call me a Polak. Fantastic quotation that shows how Stanley feels about all of this. He feels like he has a right to be an American. Yes, he feels like he has this absolute right to claim his Americanism. And her describing him as other, her describing him as alien, and using the derogatory term Polak in order to do it, that just reminds him of everything that he doesn't want to believe about America. He doesn't want to believe that America has this class system. He doesn't want to believe that America has this, you can only get on in America if you're an old family with a long family name and history. He wants to believe that he can make something for himself in this country, and that he doesn't want to be reminded by someone like Blanche of his status as an other and someone who's not part of America. Then you don't need much from the first half of page 80. It's just Stanley gets a phone call and decides he's going to go bowling. But about halfway down page 80, he takes more sadistic pleasure here, because he says, oh, Blanche, I've got a little birthday present for you, sort of pretending to be all nice. And Blanche again, oh, Stanley, I wasn't expecting anything, still trying to observe the niceties and pretend like this is all a nice situation, when obviously it's a horrific, awful situation. And then Stanley, with a sort of flourish, gives her the envelope and says, there you go, there's your ticket back to Laurel. So he's bought her a ticket home, basically showing her she's not welcome here anymore. The Varsuviana music comes back in. We know that the Varsuviana was what was playing just before Alan killed himself. This time she tries to laugh. She gets up, she springs from the table, runs into the next room. Top of page 81, she clutches her throat and then runs into the bathroom. Coughing, gagging sounds are heard. So we see that the mental breakdown is now starting to move into the physical side of things as well. The effect of Blanche's mind is almost starting to have a physical choking effect on her. Stanley doesn't buy it. Look, delicate piece she is. So Stanley, he just believes all of this is an act. He doesn't think she deserves or needs any sympathy from him. He thinks that all of this is part of the same fiction that she's cooking up. I'm just going to check I haven't missed anything I wanted to talk about. Here we go. Birthday ticket. Yeah, I think we've covered all of that. Cool. Anyway, so page 81. Stella says, she was so delicate, she was so gentle. People like you abused her and forced her to change. So, a little bit of foreshadowing there about the idea of Stanley abusing and forcing Blanche to change. Again, I won't say too much, I don't want to spoil the ending. He crosses into the bedroom, ripping off his shirt, changing into a brilliant silk bowling shirt. So again, he puts on these bright colours. Even his dress, right, he's representing his boldness, his brightness. Remember Van Gogh's painting that we looked at? All of these bright, bold colours that represent Stanley come into play at this point. Bottom of the page, Stanley says what is probably quite true, I think. He says, look, when we first met, me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as dirt. You showed me that snapshot of the place with the columns. I pulled you down off those columns and how you loved it. So interesting metaphor there from Stanley, that he pulled her down. That we talk about someone being on a pedestal, someone being held up on a pedestal, like they're better than other people. Stanley uses this idea of those columns of Belle-Reve, the big grand house at Belle-Reve had columns outside it. And Stanley said, I pulled you down off those columns and how you loved it. Again, having those coloured lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here? That's such a brilliant metaphor for the North, the old South and the new South of America, right? Because what Stanley's essentially saying is, Stella, when you became part of the new South, everything was great. When you accepted that you liked my commonness, that you liked my rough, new Americanisms, everything was great. Everything was perfect. But when the old South came back, when the old South came back into our lives, that was when it all started to go wrong. Then, crucially, there's a stage direction that tells us that Stella is not looking completely comfortable. She leans back on the chair, a blind look and a listening expression. So something is starting to happen. Something's starting to change for Stella. And wasn't we happy together? Top of page 82 now. Wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here? Hoity-toity, describing me as an ape. So we see that's what he takes to heart more than anything else. This idea that he's uncultured, that he's not good enough. He holds on to this kind of stuff and he believes that is what is wrong. And then Stella says quietly, take me to the hospital. So Stella has gone into labour at this point, which crucially means that Blanche is now going to be left alone in the house. Stella says, take me to the hospital. He takes her off. The Varsuviana is heard, but it rises sinister. It rises with a sinister rapidity. So the music is representing Blanche's crumbling mental state here. She begins to whisper, and the scene ends with this quite haunting image of her saying this old kind of Mexican folk chant, El pan de me, el pan de me, el pan de me sin salt, means like kind of cornbread without salt. So just like a kind of childish, silly nursery rhyme thing, but obviously quite a haunting image to see a grown woman with that creepy music getting faster and faster, whispering this kind of childlike nursery rhyme. Very haunting, very dark image for that scene to be left with. Right, use this video to make the notations on that chapter. Well done for the essays that I got last week. There's some nice stuff in there. And again, I will give you a day to make these notes and then I will set the essay tomorrow. All right, all the best, guys. I will speak to you soon.